you see lots of Fortune 100 companies, Fortune 1000 companies standing up their own geopolitical intelligence unit inside of corporate security that actually is getting as much visibility as that executive protection boss. But now companies are relying upon their internal security team to be that provider of the analytical content on the world stage.
Welcome to the Circuit Magazine, the #1 source of information on protection matters, the industry-leading magazine for all security professionals who want to stay ahead of the game.
The evolution of protective intelligence and EP. Today, Sean West and myself are delighted to be hearing from the one and only Fred Burton, Executive Director at the Center for Protective Intelligence. How are you doing, Sean? And why is protective intelligence such an exciting topic for our audience?
Hi, Pelham. I'm feeling great. Thank you very much. And it's definitely great to have someone of the stature of Fred Burton on the show. So it'd be good to hear what these little nuggets of information he brings. But protective intelligence, it's hugely important. It's a growing skill and desired skill within our sector of EP. But, I think one of your recent events, there was a couple of people talking about it. What's the benefits? How does it look if you're an EP agent wanting to get into, offer this as a service, learning more about protective intelligence? And it's hard to differentiate. Is it a skill in its own right? Or the best way to describe it is, one can be a jack of all trades and a master of none. Is that the route to go down? Is the more rounded operator someone who has got a skill set, being an analyst and seeking intelligence and information to provide to their client, or should they focus on the hard skills of what their role is? And I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer. It all depends on who the client is, what the budgets are for that particular family, organisation, or whoever they are. Because from a government perspective, you have unlimited resources. In the private sector, some clients maybe not so. The need for an executive protection operator to grow their own skill sets of learning open source intelligence for their own background and personal development, because they can offer more, because not everyone's going to pay for that dedicated service, I guess.
That's right, yeah, and that brings into question whether or not we're talking the protective intelligence specialist, or, as you say, jack of all trades. Is it something embedded into everyone? Maybe we're using third parties, but it really gets the core of the future protector. And maybe, do you know what? It's better to look at the future protector as one with a protective intelligence skill set as well. I'm just throwing it out there. Maybe we can put it to Fred, than to say, oh, you can't code, you can't do cybersecurity, you can't do very specific TSEM. Maybe the umbrella term of protective intelligence is a better approach.
Mm-hmm. I think any operator, when you're growing your skill set and you want to provide better service, dipping your toe in all of these areas, protective intelligence, surveillance awareness, keeping your med training going, keeping everything going, all of these little skill sets that build up your persona, the service that you can offer is a good thing. So I think definitely, this area is growing. It's one that I'm certainly interested in. We should be looking at these sort of things because you'll be able to offer a better service and give better advice to your client, should it be required. So I don't think there's anything wrong in looking at growing your skill set in that area. And I don't think there's anything wrong with, throwing yourself all in and actually doing it as a career.
I like it. Well, let's get into it with Fred, and let's really bring some extra value to our audience. It's a great honor to finally welcome Fred Burton, Executive Director, Center for Protective Intelligence, to the podcast to talk evolution of protective intelligence and EP.
And now, let's meet one of the contributors to the Circuit Magazine.
The evolution of protective intelligence and EP. We're delighted to welcome the one and only Fred Burton, Executive Director, Center for Protective Intelligence at ONTIC. How are you?
I'm wonderful, Phelim. Thank you so much for having me on the program.
Well, I can't believe we haven't had you on sooner. And of course, there's a great ecosystem that has encouraged us to come together as well. But we'll get into that. We're talking today about the evolution of protective intelligence and EP, and of course, we know why we might be talking to you about EP. But protective intelligence, what is the problem that it's trying to solve for the protector? Is it simply informing them about relevant events, or is there something a bit deeper?
Well, it's actually a wonderful topic, and we could probably do a PhD thesis and spend 3 hours just discussing this. But, at the end of the day, Phelim, when I was part of the program that developed the protective intelligence concept or model at the State Department Diplomatic Security Service in the 1980s, and in essence, everything that we were doing from the protection side just simply wasn't working. And the more and more I started to dissect attacks, either on diplomatic personnel, the private sector, hostage taking, or whatever, I uncovered tremendous gaps in our knowledge base. And I kind of figured that if we started looking for threat actors and trying to collect the dots so we could connect the dots, that perhaps we could get in front of some of these attacks from an attack cycle perspective, which always begins with that intelligence collection of the target. It always begins with a concept that I've written about for years called pre-operational surveillance. So we were fortunate to have some very good bosses in the 80s that listened and allowed us to apply that model for the likes of Princess Diana, the British royals, the children when they would come with Diana, the likes of Yasser Arafat and Nelson Mandela when he was released from prison. And then, as others have said, I was the one that transitioned this concept into the private sector in late 1998 and early 1999. And in many ways, it's become the base, or some have said the gold standard for how you protect CEOs, companies, and so forth.
Okay, and I'd like in a little bit to get into why that's a baseline, because some people might say, "Oh, it's Gates, Guns, and Guards," or something like that, right? And of course, I'm on your side there. But what about you? Where does your passion for this really come from? Maybe a bit about your background you've already explained, but where does your passion come from?
Well, it's a good question. I'm sure some of the shrinks that may watch this may key on a few things. When I was growing up, I had an Israeli air attaché that was assassinated in my neighborhood when I was a teenager. And so I joined our local rescue squad that actually responded that night to the political assassination of this Israeli diplomat in the 1970s. And then I became a police officer in the same town and county where this crime occurred. And then I became a State Department special agent, Phelim, in the days of the hijackings and embassy bombings and hostage takings. And I don't know why, but right out of basic agent training, I was assigned to our counterterrorism division, which was just basically 3 of us for the world. And I had the Middle East. So my responsibility was, the groups like Hezbollah, Black September, all of your radical, at that time, Soviet-backed organizations such as the Red Army faction, the Italian Red Brigades, the Japanese Red Army. And our counterterrorism division became the protective intelligence division after studying all these attacks and knowing that we had to fill these gaps to try to keep our people alive. So, whether it was fate or just my life falling into these different positions, Phelim, it's something that I'm not so sure I would call it a passion. It's just what I do.
No, I think many can resonate with that. Obviously, not with the illustrious history you've got, but with that sort of it is what you have become. So I think that is very fair. But what about the uninitiated protector? And by that, I'm thinking the protector that's never really thought that they're involved in protective intelligence. They sort of leave it to others. They don't know enough about the whole concept. Where should they begin?
That's a great question. I certainly would encourage anybody interested in either how to start or develop a protective intelligence program to visit our Center for Protective Intelligence, which is the purpose as to why we developed this think tank to be thought leaders in this space. And I'm truly honored to be able to run that and to research and to look at things from the lens of a protective intelligence aspect, and then try to apply some of the things I've learned over the years to still fill gaps. And there's still gaps that are out there, Phelim. So to those that want to learn more about this, there's a wealth of material on our center. And then there's obviously wonderful organizations such as ATAP, as well as ASIS that has various online training. And look, I'm a student of protection history. I go back to look for certain events that have really transformed our industry. I gave a keynote to the State Department a couple years back at one of the OSAC conferences, where I looked at certain almost 10-year blocks where our industry has shifted going back to the 60s, which created, for example, campus police departments. The chief security officer really came out of that time frame. And then you look into the 80s, where you had international security managers that were developed as a result of hijackings and the murders and kidnappings of business people overseas. So as you look at that from the landscape of a rear view mirror, you can see how this industry has changed. And one of the things that I've noticed in our space in the time that I've been involved with our center, which has been about 3 years now, is that we have a rapidly evolving field of this concept that really warms my heart, called the protective intelligence analyst, because I actually created that first position when I first transitioned to the private sector. So when you combine a protective intelligence analyst with a protector as a practitioner, you really can leverage that. And it's a concept that I actually kind of started back in the 80s, when I used to drag analysts kicking and fighting to the actual debriefing of either victims of terrorist attacks, or in some cases suspects or sources inside of organizations. So to help them better understand the tick-tock as to how some of these attacks are put together.
That's great advice, and I think maybe we will see that merger a little bit more with roles or at least collaboration. But taking a step back and trying to head off some questions that our protector community might have, you managed to move this concept from the State Department to the private sector. And the State Department and government often has larger resources than the private sector. What message can we give right now to private security professionals to say, do you know what? This is 100% in your remit, in your ballpark. You don't have to have the might of the State Department behind you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I've gotten a lot over the years. And in essence, when I transitioned this concept into the private sector, I was reasonably confident that the counter-surveillance component of the actual practical application and a protector's role in the private sector would work, because I had many CEOs tell me this. I want security, but I don't really want to see it. And I said, well, heck, that's easy. We had been doing that for years and had a very good track record in the public sector of keeping an eye on the likes of a Salman Rushdie or a Yasser Arafat or Harry and William when they were children, I was a bit concerned of losing access to all the different intelligence resources you have at the federal level, which can be overwhelming. So in many ways, you really had the shackles come off when you're in the private sector, because you're not burdened by that classified take, air quote take, that if it's not classified secret or top secret or even confidential, then how am I going to do my job? And in many ways, I still see that transition problem with people that I mentor that look to transition out of the government. Because one day you see everything that Five Eyes could ever produce, and the next day you don't. And you're sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do now? And so the whole concept of protective intelligence is one that you really have to start looking for the needles, but the haystack is not as large, and you'll very quickly learn that you no longer really have to worry about 1,000 different problems in the private sector. You have to look at your footprint. You have to look at the profile of your company. You have to look at the profile of your executives and really get some clarity down to those potential threat actors that could be affecting them, with an eye towards doing this in a very cost-efficient manner, which is why, at a practical application, the counter-surveillance component of protective intelligence is just picture perfect for the kind of work we do. And quite frankly, we do work with some of the largest companies in the world, and everyone is utilizing this model today that I'm aware of, or taking components of it and plugging and playing it into how they're actually doing their job, because no two programs are alike. The Secret Service program is much different than what the State Department's program is, which is different from what the U.S. Capitol Police is, different from the Supreme Court Police, different from the CIA. And then as you step into the private sector, no two programs are really identical. They've adapted to the business needs of that company.
And so that's sort of reassuring, because it means that, it will adapt to your size. You could be a solo operator. You could be a really large team. But then drilling down, I wonder who is protective intelligence. I know that's a weird way to phrase it, but is it needed to have a protective security or protective intel analyst in every team? Or is it the job of every operator? Is it the job of every team leader? Or is it something they leave to a third-party SOC?
I've seen all of the above. And ideally, when I'm doing advice or consulting from individuals for companies that are looking to either begin these programs, the first thing is to understand from your own threat landscape, what is that baseline and what is the threats that's affecting you. And again, that's going to vary depending upon the industry and sector you're in, the profile of your CEO, and a list of baseline questions. So, for example, is your CEO Jewish? Do you have operations in places that are very dangerous, like Iraq or Lebanon at times, or operating in Israel? Or are you just focused on a building around London or in New York City? So it's going to vary. And then as you start to put your team together, I always hire with an idea of, I don't care about your background per se. I don't care about your certifications per se. Are you inquisitive? What is your quality of mind? Are you desirous of doing the job? Do you like to do this kind of work? For example, are you good at writing? Are you good at observing? Or are you that kind of operator that just wants to do that advanced work and is really not interested in expanding that bubble a little bit? So I think the beauty of this business is that you literally can multitask and do all of the above at times, or depending upon the size of your team and program, you can laser focus on what truly inspires you or challenges you. Because I have found over the course of, 40 years now of doing this, that you would be surprised as to who is good at this at times. You can take that crusty old burned out officer that nobody really wants on the team at times, to be blunt, but you'll find that they can be very unique in perhaps an observation or a counter surveillance position. And they also could potentially be very good at an analytical kind of valuation of certain things. So I think that depends a lot upon the size of your team, the leadership of your team, and the mindset of those that are driving either the company or your unit, or if you're that lone practitioner, what kind of contracts are you working on?
And I guess depending on size, it depends, what you need. So as we move to more tech-based aids, there are more tech SaaS platforms out there that help, with this. The question I tend to get on a podcast is, well, how do I make it relevant? And especially if I'm obtaining it through tech, if it is that, shall we say, crusty old operator, which you paint a picture of, who's got amazing analytical capabilities, then they know how to tailor it. But as people buy off-the-shelf solutions and SaaS platforms, how can we ensure that is tailored, especially when we're dealing with a range of people, from a solo operator through to a big NASDAQ 500 company?
Great question. And well, I would like to think, and I have no doubt, that the platform that our company offers is the gold standard. Or to be blunt, I would not be here. And I can say that with a high degree of certainty. Now, I know that platforms like what we have and others that are in this competitive space can be filtered and tailored to your unique collection needs. However, I think it's critical, if you're in this business, that you really do a lot of benchmarking to see, with comparable teams, what are others using? And is there, for example, today a mobile application that you have? Because I think that's been critical, and that's really been a transition shift in our industry. When I first started in this business, we didn't have cell phones. We had typewriters and 3x5 index cards. So when you look today at what you can do with your mobile, and you want to have that capability because of the travel, and then just basics, if you are trying to protect an estate of an ultra high net worth individual, you want your midnight crew to be able to rapidly report suspicious events. So mobile is critical in this business. So I would encourage anybody that's looking for these kinds of platforms to make sure that the platform also has the ability to plug and play and to integrate other components that you might already have. So, for example, I know from many of the Fortune 100s that we work with, a lot of them have their own internal kind of incident reporting system or investigative capabilities that they share across the spectrum between loss prevention and supply chain and travel. So you want to be able to integrate that into a platform. You want to be able to integrate in license plate readers if you have that capability. You want to be able to have that mobile application, but then you also want it to be able to filter down on sensitive kinds of investigations. So, for example, if you're including insider threat on that not everybody needs to see that, right? It depends upon, again, your remit. It depends upon the kind of business that you're involved with. And I know, for example, we have many, many clients that are literally one-person shops. And then we have clients that have thousands of security personnel. So you want a platform, regardless of who you choose, that has the ability to scale, because your 3-person security team may be 12 people next year, and it may be 50 people 3 years from now, and as you grow. So there's a lot of good choices out there in this space today, and I'm really very excited as we look over the horizon of other things that could possibly be coming that you're going to want to integrate. For example, like drones.
Well, I think drones will be a fascinating angle, and I remember when I run an annual CP Tech Forum, and one year we got some drone pilot teachers, and we said, does everyone need a drone license in the future? So that there is all of that. But the other type of feed, which I don't know, it's sort of a chicken and egg, or is it a solution in search of a problem in search of a solution? Cyber threat intelligence. I can't quite get my head around where CTI is going to get into the day-to-day operations of a protector, or maybe a protection team. So maybe I'll formulate that into another question. Are there any limits on protective intelligence where we got to say, do you know what, we hand it over to another discipline?
It's, I think, one of the more unique challenges in our industry, not only as we are operating today, but on the horizon, meaning you see a lot on LinkedIn in the echo chamber of cyber physical convergence. Well, what really is that? Does that mean standing up a fusion center or a GSOC that has a combination of cyber and physical? I've seen that. As we know in this business, cyber and IT almost speak a different language versus physical. And over in the physical side, we have our own way of doing things. So at times, the integration of those two can be challenging. Now, where I see it really, really taking off over the past 18 months is in the insider threat space, where you see that convergence of investigators, physical security practitioners, executive protection personnel, a little bit on the periphery, but concerned about that insider threat that may try to approach the CEO or their family. So I look as the insider threat is almost the model of how it could work efficiently. And I know many, many companies that have gone down that path, and I see that just simply growing. And at the end of the day, it boils down to, again, what are your collection requirements, right? What are you trying to collect against? Are you trying to collect against that insider that's working in a sophisticated lab that may try to run off or sell that intellectual property that's taken you 2 years to develop? Are you trying to watch that disgruntled insider that has a bone to pick with their boss and may come in with a pistol one day? So, or all of the above. So you have to set your requirements for what you're trying to collect against from a threat perspective, and then stand up accordingly those internal subject matter experts in that space. And if need be, bring in maybe a little outside third-party embeds or consultants to help you find unique kinds of things that you might be looking to collect against.
I like that because that's a roadmap, isn't it? What are you protecting against? It could have a cyber element. It could also maybe not. It just depends what you're protecting against. But then going back, and I often like to put myself in the shoes of a protector who says, well, what sort of skills am I going to need, and how am I going to get them? I want to formulate a question about fear of missing out, because at the latest forum where Chuck Randolph very, very kindly moderated a panel in London, they mentioned, that there's perhaps a fear of being seen to not know things, which could drive the clamor for all intelligence. What's going on in this country that is completely not relevant. There's a fear. They want to know about it in case they might get caught out or so on. Is that going to ever go away? Is it a solvable problem? Is it literally a case of team leader says, I do everything and you get told what you should know? How can we mitigate a fear of missing out?
I think it's a fascinating question, because I think the nature of the kind of people that we are in this business is We're naturally inquisitive. We watch the world. We look at events such as balloons floating over the United States, and we are fixated on that. But at the end of the day, what's the probability and likelihood of that Chinese balloon targeting my specific footprint? Probably highly remote. So I think it's critical in moments like this where there's so much going on in the world, such as the war in Ukraine, the shadow war in Ukraine, meaning if you have operations in that region or you're supporting that in some capacity, then yes, you have to be laser fixated on those threat streams and the ramifications of that. But if you have nothing to do with what's going on there, that's the kind of problem that your GSOC or your intelligence analyst or that protector really shouldn't be spending all their time worrying about, collecting about, studying it. I would refocus their interests back into the threats that are driven towards your company. And I've had many clients that are starting up operations at some of the world's largest companies, and at times they don't know where to begin. And I think what happens in this space is that if you are a protector and you're plugged into an existing program, you'll hear, well, this is the way we've always done it before. When I hear that, it tells me that really needs to be relooked at, because I guarantee you that there's things you could update, fix, correct, course correct if this is the way we've always been doing that. And that was one of, if I can digress early on in my career, when I first approached our director with this concept of protective intelligence. And one of the questions back to me was, well, we've been protecting people this way since the 1950s. And I said, well, we haven't been doing it very efficiently or effectively, to be blunt, boss. And he said, well, you've touched on a good point. So I think in this business, you always have to be able to reset and relook and to rethink how you're doing things, regardless of the size of your team. And I've always found that fresh eyes helps with that. It's much like cold case investigations, Philip. Your best eyes is someone that's never looked at that case before, to go through that, to say, hey, what about this? The same thing can be applied to any of these programs. Now, look, I'm a realist. A lot of programs don't want that for fear of being exposed instead of fear of missing out. But sometimes the best things you can do is to have someone else take a look at your program and provide some constructive criticism as to some things that you should think about. All things being considered: budget, manpower, staffing, corporate culture, you name it.
So does that, I like that. So if we run with that, does that have implications for standards? Because the moment someone sets one, it should be relooked, looked at again. It should be evolving. It should be an organic document. And I don't want to draw us into maybe, the wonderful world of standard arguments. Who knew that the question about standards would be such a hot potato? But do you think that we could become advocates for rolling review, or how does that work? Because you mentioned initially that you advocate pre-ops surveillance. Where does that sit, for example, with advanced work? And in which case, does that mean we have to completely relook at everything each time, or are there certain standards we can go by?
I think when you look at this concept of standards, I think that there are some minimal basic things that really need to be done. However, I can say this with a high degree of certainty that just because it's written down doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be followed. I've investigated a lot of attacks, for example, on embassy security, which have more standards than probably anything you can imagine, and still you'll have successful threat actors be capable of carrying out all kinds of different attacks because they've adapted their threat model after looking at your standards. And I think that the problem with our business is you can get stuck in that mindset that, well, I've done my due diligence. I've driven that route. I know where we're going to drop the protectee off. I know what door we're going to enter. I've gone through the motions. And it's been my experience in this business that when you're just going through the motions, doing the basics that are required, you usually miss a lot of things. You miss the ability to step back and to kind of holistic look at what you're doing. And therefore, that's why I am a proponent of having others, for example, red team your operations, or even taking the newest person on the job to say, what do you think we're doing here that works? What do you think we're doing here that doesn't work? And what would you do differently? Now, I'm very open to that kind of idea. I know a lot of people aren't. I'm the boss. This is the way it's been done, and this is what I want you to do. But in reality, to me, it's always best to try to have divergent thought process, even contrarian thought process, and even an alternative analysis as to whatever kind of problem that you're looking at, because in essence, in many ways, that will raise discussions as to how you could do things a little bit better, and in all probability, expose weaknesses into your program. And sometimes, especially for those programs that are, air quote, well established, well, we've always used that same driver, and this is always that limo company we've used in London. Well, let's stop back and think for a minute now. Does that limo company have continuous monitoring of their drivers? Has that limo company kept up with new vehicles? Are we utilizing the same driver, or is it one person differently in that job every other day? So I think evaluation of all these programs is always good and should be ongoing. That's why there's never enough manpower in many ways to do everything that needs to be done in this space. That's why it takes good bosses, good leadership to say, with the manpower that I have, what can I apply to a specific problem realistically?
Okay, and so not everyone will have the manpower for an entire protective intelligence team. Some people will rely on third parties. Some people seem to be very, very interested in social media intelligence. And I guess then we had a segment on the grey professional and all of that. But with social media intelligence and with the evolution of protective intelligence, when you're relying on some more automated factors, I spoke before about tailoring it. But what about the challenge of where maybe you put good stuff into the machine, good stuff comes out the machine, right? What if
supposedly?
Supposedly, we had a while ago the example of, I want to know about any floods. Floods were not mentioned, but sluice gates opening was mentioned, and that was missed. And alternatively, someone said, "Oh no, in Israel there is a massive protest," but if you looked out the window, it was a couple of people with placards. Obviously, we can build brilliant protective intelligence systems, but then when we outsource them, how do we make sure that the good stuff comes into that machine?
It's a great question, and this gets back into the whole concept of ground truth, right? For example, I can recall a vivid problem not too long ago with one of a client that I was working with that could not get a handle on carjackings in South Africa. And in essence, this chief security officer had even hired one of the former heads of the South African police. And that person could not get a handle on that either. And then they reached out to me and said, how are you going to go about collecting this kind of data? And I said, some problems aren't fixable, meaning you might not have a solution to this problem if the former head of the South African police cannot, on the ground in Cape Town, cannot figure out the carjacking problem. You're not going to have an automated feed that will, nor am I going to be able to do that. Simply put, there's too many of them to collect, or you don't have the reporting of that coming into any kind of feed to include the cops. Now, that's not an answer that most clients want to hear, but it's reality. And I think in our business, that's part of the challenge, meaning the challenge is the haystack today of information, the fire hose, whatever you want to call it. That was never the challenge when I was early on in this business. We never had enough intelligence. Now the question becomes, how do I make sense of the intelligence I'm collecting? And that boils back to your intelligence requirements that you're collecting against. Is it something as simple as the name of your CEO and maybe their spouse? Or is it all of your executives? Is it just your company name? Or is it those catch-all phrases of guns, bombs, shooting, active shooting, kidnapping, whatever that might be? And you'll tend to see that you also are flooded with things like that, because you'll get every crime that's happened in and around the city of Chicago, which would be endless, right? So it becomes really an intelligence analytical problem, but you can be able to set up with your software platform partners great filters to be able to weed that down to a trickle, so you only get what you deem as important, not what the system deems, not what others might think is important, but what you think is important to your operations. And that might be a square block in New York City, right? Or in downtown London. So it's really going to depend upon what your remit is and that threat stream that you're collecting against.
No, that makes sense, and I think that sheds a lot of light on maybe what the protector is going to have to deal with themselves, because maybe the protector will not go to night school and become an intelligence analyst later in life. Maybe it doesn't require night school. I don't know. I'm imagining that. Maybe it's about SaaS tweaking. It's about working with third parties to be bespoke, so that you don't rock up in Egypt and find out that there are pyramids, which some people like to say.
I think you're spot on with that. You're spot on with that. If your third-party vendor, or however you've got your SaaS-based product set up, if you're getting too much, you have a problem. That needs to be readjusted. And it's been my experience in this space that there's enough vendors in this business. If they're not listening, you have a lot of choices and a lot of options, right? And sometimes you have to make the hard decisions. But my point is that if you're not getting the intelligence feeds that you need to help you do your job as a protector, then you need to look for another partner.
Yeah. Which yeah, I mean, to be honest, there's a lot of people offering feeds. I guess the systems, they are not as frequently found, but there are lots of people saying plug in this feed, plug in that feed, which I think can only be a good thing as people tailor it. So taking advantage of the fact that you can give us a beautiful overview of protection, I want to maybe ask what you think we're going to be protecting in the years to come, because the evolution of what an executive is and is not. Okay, you got the high net worth individual, they've employed you and whatever, that's fine. But I'd be interested in your reflections on what an executive has been and will be throughout the ages. A little spoiler, some people have suggested that we protect system administrators who have the complete keys to the IT kingdom, right? And currently they are not protected in that way. So across time, evolution of executives. Please, your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I see a lot of misdirected resources at times because that's just the way we've always done things, right? They're stuck in that fighting the last war, protecting that last exec because that's the way we've always done things. And change is hard. Change is hard in this business. Forecasting over the horizon, which I've done for many years in my previous capacity, is difficult to do. What I see more and more developing, which I'm really excited about, is I see corporate security departments doing two things. One, at least in the continental United States, they're going it alone. They no longer can rely upon public safety, your traditional police resources to help you. At times, you will get no response by the cops in some cities to certain kinds of crime. Therefore, that burden has been shifted back to the private sector to safeguard employees, safeguarding customers. You are literally on your own. It's kind of a difficult mindset to wrap your mind around, but when you start looking at just practical response times to crimes in progress, at least here in the United States, I don't know about Europe, they're drastically increasing, and in some cases, they're not showing up at all. So that's the first thing you have to think about if you're looking over the horizon. How am I going to protect my company operating in Kansas City or in Austin, Texas, knowing that my 911 call may or may not come? Different way of thinking of problems. And even your C-suite will have a hard time wrapping their head around that unless they're watching the daily news every day where this is constantly there, right? So that's the first problem. The second thing for multinational corporations that I see that I really, really like is that you see lots of Fortune 100 companies, Fortune 1000 companies standing up their own geopolitical intelligence unit inside of corporate security that actually is getting as much visibility as that executive protection boss. Everybody knows who that executive protection boss is because they're always with that CEO. But now, more and more companies are relying upon their internal security team to be that provider of the analytical content on the world stage. What do I mean by that? Where do you see the war going in the Ukraine? Where do you see NATO's response being? What if, God forbid, Putin does cook off a nuke? What is the ramifications to us, the second and third level impacts? What if China does move on Taiwan? What does that do to my supply chain? And I see that happening more and more. And so when I talk to young kids wanting to get in this business, I usually encourage them to go through two different jobs. Become a protective intelligence analyst and help out your team to protect your people, places, and executives. Or look in the realm of private sector intelligence where you're providing that geopolitical analytical analysis to your C-suite so they can make some business decisions. And that is really trending up. I see that more and more happening.
Business enabler rather than a department of no.
Exactly. No, you can't do that. Or no, your answer should always be yes, but, right? Instead of no. Can we go to Kabul? It's probably not a good idea, but let us take a look to see if maybe we can get you in and out kind of thing, instead of just a flat out no.
Yeah, I think, and that would of course differ if it's a high net worth, family office type environment and corporate. But the yes, but I think is universal. And it's interesting what you said about the evolution of internal protective intelligence and internal geopolitical intelligence, especially these last 3 years. We don't want to get into too much of the last 3 years because we all lived through it. But maybe there's an element of some information not being available as readily. And so, probably a good idea for companies. Do you think it's been a wake-up call for companies to invest in their own protective intelligence?
Absolutely. And we saw this surface out of the pandemic, meaning you could look at back when I was in the government ages ago, every national intelligence estimate, I don't care which one you read from what country, would always say that there's a probability of that. It might be a black swan event, low probability, high impact, but when it does happen, meaning if you go back before the pandemic hit us and you had gone to your boss and said, hey, boss, I'm worried about a global pandemic that's going to shut down our company and nobody's ever going to go to work again for the next year. Your boss would have looked at you and said, don't you have more important things to do? My point with that is this, that really was a wake-up call from the boards to the C-suite down to the CSO to the creation of chief risk officers, legal officers now worried about this globally, to the point now that is really a good talking point for those trying to develop this kind of program, because rest assured, if China moves on Taiwan, there's serious ramifications to all of us around the globe, and there's going to be an impact to your company. Now, if you are that security officer listening to this podcast today, and if you've not thought about how that could impact your business and how you do your job, you need to start thinking about that big time. God forbid it ever happens, but you need to start thinking about that. Same thing with how this war is going to progress in Europe, much closer home to you, as well as things such as what if Israel does conduct a preemptive strike on Iran? What are the ramifications to us? Where is my personnel located in the Middle East? Do I have a footprint in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem? How am I going to get my people out if air travel stops? So these are the kinds of things that you really can start thinking about and really provide value to your entire corporation. Even if you're a one-person shop, you can do some of these things.
Perfect. And I dare imagine that type of desktop tabletop training is more engaging than it's a spreadsheet this and someone broke through a door that I think that there would be some actual training entertainment value, something engaging for your staff if you do deal with black swan events, which I don't know. Maybe answers on a postcard. Do you think that listenership? Do you think that is an engaging form of training? I do hope so. So Fred, what is next for you? I see, obviously this is audio, but on your shelves you have some fantastic books behind you. What should people look out for moving forward, and perhaps in the canon of books that you've written, what would you like to tell people about?
Well, thank you so much for raising that question. Yes, I've been fortunate or blessed to have been published, and I do have a couple more books on the horizon. Unfortunately, I'm not at liberty to discuss the subject of them at this point because that's still in my people's hands, as we would like to say, my agents' hands and publishers. But stay tuned, and I would certainly encourage anybody that's interested in the topic of protective intelligence to visit our Center for Protective Intelligence. All of our content is free. And so that was one of the points when we started doing this that we wanted to make. We wanted to provide thought leadership in this space, history, current trends and tactics, as well as over the horizon kinds of things. And I always say this in any of the interviews or podcasts that I'm doing, if there's anything that I could do to help any of your listeners understand this topic or try to figure out how we got here, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and you can reach me through our Center for Protective Intelligence. Easy enough.
Fantastic. And I'm sure if they do want to read a book you have previously written, they're in all good bookstores and available, or maybe a site, because we can put a site in the show notes for today's session.
Oh, well, that's awesome. Well, I have my own website, which is officialfredburton.com, and all of my books are available there. And my last book was a story of the CIA station chief that was kidnapped and murdered in Beirut, Lebanon. I tend to want to look at stories that have a protector's mindset or lens through these events so we can all learn from some of these horrific disasters that's happened in the past.
Fantastic, and that is preemptive protective intelligence in at work, isn't it? I think that's a fantastic place to leave it on. Obviously, there are so many other aspects we could have looked at. We could have done a complete history tour de force of protection, looking at your from your vantage point. But I think this is a fantastic look at the evolution of protective intelligence and EP. So Fred, thank you very much for coming on. It's been wonderful finally having you on. And from myself and, of course, our entire team, this has been another fantastic edition of the Circuit Magazine podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on the Circuit podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Fred, for coming onto the Circuit Magazine and really sharing your wealth of experience. It's a vast career. I'm back with Sean West. Sean, how was today's session for you?
No, it was great. It was and I guess Fred touched on what we spoke about in the intro before we actually went into the conversation. Exactly what I was saying. Protective intelligence is definitely an area that is growing and something we all need to be more aware of moving forward, especially the way the landscape's growing with tools that are out there. People definitely need to take a look and try and make more use of these. It was just interesting that he spoke about there seems to be a shift of companies not relying on government intelligence now because maybe they don't have the intelligence dedicated to what they want, or they just don't want to share it. So if you need something specific form of intelligence, you need to go out there, find it yourself, or get a third party who can provide you that intelligence. And there's a lot of tools popping up there now. I mean, just on the personal front, one perfect example of an app that shares intelligence, Waze, the navigation device, just intelligence on the road for individual users. Driving along, there's an accident on the road, you see people tagging, there's the car accident there, traffic, and the traffic will divert. That's just a simplified version of intelligence, not on the protective front, but of a simple tool that's out there where people put into and provide intelligence of something that's going on in an area specific to where they're going.
Yeah, that's right. And maybe then it's the job of the protector to trust but verify, or become an analyst and sort of say, "Oh, does this make sense?" Maybe it is the job of an external agency. I don't know, but I sense there is, as Fred suggested, a shift towards the public sort of hands and getting to grips with this.
Yeah, I mean, there's many companies have the dedicated tools out there, but I think it's also good within your networks. I think another thing that was spoken about at one of your events was in London. There's different groups out there, intelligence network on WhatsApp. So all operators in different areas of different parts of London, they'll tag on there. There's a protest in Pall Mall taking place tomorrow, and they'll tag these events. And it's just another little outlet, a bit of reach that you can see. And exactly what you said, you have to look at this information. It comes to you, then you go and verify it by doing your own research. You can't go and get all this information yourself all of the time. You rely on other providing as well, and it's a give and take scenario. If you're aware of something happening, you can post it up there, and it's an information share which can help the operation that you're going on.
I like it. And the other interesting thing to note is that Fred is connected to something that we are a media partner for and are supporting, isn't it?
Yeah, it's great. Fred's going to be speaking at the Bodyguards for Children event on the 18th and 19th of March, which is a fantastic event, which the Circuit are proud to be a media sponsor of. Pelham, you will have the link that you can share with our audience and get people to send their donations. Make a donation, helps the children out there, and also gives you access to a whole range of guest speakers So it's not just a give, you're receiving as well.
That's right. And I will put the link in our description inside the podcast. Yes, that donation will be your ticket to the event. I will be co-moderating it with Chuck Randolph, who is, of course, working with Fred, and so actually, it was a suggestion initially of Chuck that we reach out finally to Fred and bring him on the podcast. So that's nicely squaring a circle. And what else have we got coming up, Sean?
We're working on the next issue of the Circuit magazine. We're also looking for new podcast contributors. We need to get some more queued up. So if you are interested, drop us a line. There's certainly some good people at your event, your in-person event in London, Pelham, which I'm sure we can drag along and get them on the show. Some great viewpoints, some great stories there, which I'm sure people will be happy to share and listen to.
That's right. Yeah. So if you have a story to share or perhaps a particular topic you think we are not covering, we very much do want to hear from you. We will keep plugging away. We've had some very diverse topics this year already, ranging from adding an MD to your team and then threat intel and the asymmetric protector. Lots of different topics already, but we have an entire year. So we're very pleased if you would come forward and let us know what you want. But yes, please keep all your comments coming. The BBA Connect app is very, very active. So thank you for supporting that and continuing to chat and boost the community. The NABA Protector app as well, of course. Elijah is spearheading lots of great discussions there along with the entire community. But I'm very much looking forward to the 18th and 19th of March when we are supporting the Bodyguards for Kids event in aid of St. Jude's Children's Hospital. And you will see more of Fred Burton there as he speaks at the event. So please look in our description below in the notes of this podcast and see how you can sign up. Right, that is the future of protective intelligence and EP through the wonderful perspective and wealth of knowledge of Fred Burton. From Sean and myself, this has been truly another fantastic edition of the Circuit Magazine podcast.
You have been listening to the Circuit Magazine podcast. Be sure to subscribe and be sure to not miss an episode.